Friends, it is good to see you all this evening. Thank you for supporting this, the first of our museum lectures to take place in the Guards Chapel. A new venture for us to bring the lecture series somewhere where it might be a little bit more accessible than the rarefied environments of rural Oxfordshire, otherwise known as Shribnham, where goodness me, is that a sign? I'll speed up a bit. My thanks to Daniel and the team for hosting us at the Guards Chapel, and indeed to the General Officer Commanding London District for his support to this event. My thanks also to Dr Rob Thompson for agreeing to come and speak to us. We were exchanging emails, I think probably still while you were in the States, to try and tie down this particular lecture. Because you don't have this lovely brochure that's been prepared, I can read to you what I wrote in this. It saves me having to do that word. Dr Thompson is a historian of the Holocaust and Christian-Jewish relations. Awarded his PhD from University College London, and has held the Pearl Resnick postdoctoral fellowship in the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a position he held until August of this year. He has received awards and scholarships for his research from the Royal Historical Society, the Wolseley Foundation, and the Parkes Institute for the study of Jewish, non-Jewish relations. His article about Christian Army chaplains at the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen was published in 2023 in the English Historical Review. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to have a look at that, I do commend that to you. I ruthlessly pilfered bits of that when I was delivering the Cambridge sermon earlier this year. So thank you for making me sound almost irrelevant. That was great work. Rob's previous work has included as Senior Programme Manager for the Council of Christians and Jews. Perhaps most importantly than all of this, Rob is also a local preacher in the Methodist Church and a son of the Mass. And that, of course, has nothing to do with why the Chaplain General, who's a Methodist, and the Deputy Chaplain General, who's a Methodist, decided this would be a very, very good invitation to this. So Rob, thank you for coming, and we are all really looking forward to what you have to share with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Chaplain General. Good evening, Chaplain General, Deputy Chaplain General, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous privilege to have been invited to deliver the annual lecture for the Royal Army Chaplains Museum. A really important space in the heritage and military history of this country, and a place that I have come to know well in my own research. And it's especially wonderful to be able to do so in this historic space. Tonight we're discussing Army Chaplaincy at the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and really I can think of few more appropriate spaces in London than this to discuss issues of faith and the renewal of faith in response to atrocity and suffering. So thank you so much for being here this evening. In July 1945, a British Army chaplain by the name of David Stewart printed a short publication. "I shall endeavour to make my pen the merest instrument," he began, "in conveying to my public the things I have seen with my eyes and heard with my ears. In short, the barest truth." Just a few weeks before, this Church of England priest had left the liberated Nazi concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. At just 58 pages, the pamphlet he produced, titled "The Crime of Belsen," was an urgent, emotional first response to the sights he witnessed at Belsen and the survivors with whom he interacted. Words he found would prove inadequate in describing what he said, "I know to be the truth." But in telling his story, Padre Stewart revealed to his readers the distinct responsibilities that army chaplains undertook at the liberation of a concentration camp and how they began to respond. A foreword was written by Stewart's commanding officer, one of the senior medical officers at Belsen, Lieutenant Colonel A.M. Campbell. Campbell wrote this: "No greater tribute can be paid to their work than was uttered by one of the medical officers. The true physicians here are the padres, and they are doing more good to the patients than anyone else." As Colonel Campbell's statement suggests, Padre Stewart was not alone at Belsen. British and Canadian army chaplains arrived with the initial liberating troops, or they were sent there with the medical units rushed in to aid survivors. Others visited in the weeks and months that followed. And amongst them were several chaplains whom I will discuss this evening. 35-year-old John Ross, a native of Stornoway and a Church of Scotland minister, entered the chaplaincy in 1939, pictured here with his family on the day he departed for war. By the time of Belsen's liberation, he was chaplain to a light anti-aircraft regiment. According to the citation for his MBE, he was a source of inspiration and faith by his quiet courage under fire and his devotion to duty. Thomas Stretch, known as TJ Stretch, was a Church of England priest from Pembrokeshire on the west coast of Wales. He signed up in the cathedral city of St David's on New Year's Day, 1943, and eventually embarked for Western Europe less than a week after D-Day. At Belsen, he was interviewed by a film crew over one of the camp's mass graves. This recording is actually played on a loop in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I've been this year, in Washington, D.C., meaning that the voice of a British Army chaplain with a lisping BBC accent and a slight Welsh intonation, it's a wonderful voice if you can hear it, is heard by hundreds of thousands of visitors to that museum every year. Leslie Hardman, who is the middle rabbi officiating, or middle person officiating at this Shavuot service in Belsen a few weeks after the liberation. Leslie Hardman was 32 when he arrived at Belsen, the first Jewish chaplain on the scene. After the war, he became well known as Rabbi of Hendon United Synagogue in northwest London, but he was originally from South Wales, and before the war, he served communities in St Anne's and Leeds. Isaac Levy, a Londoner, had a distinguished career as an army chaplain throughout the war. After serving for 3 years in the Middle East and North Africa, where he briefly escaped brief captivity as a prisoner of war, he was appointed the senior Jewish chaplain to the British Army of the Rhine. Michael Morrison, the first Roman Catholic chaplain to arrive at Belsen, was 36 and hailed from County Kerry on the southwest coast of Ireland. He was a Jesuit, and his letters to his superior in the Jesuit order in Dublin are a fascinating glimpse into the life of an army chaplain during the Second World War. His colleague, Herbert Welchman, senior Roman Catholic chaplain to the British Army's 8th Corps, had served throughout the war. He was in France in June 1940 with the British Expeditionary Force, escaping even after the Dunkirk evacuation. And he's pictured here several months after the liberation of Belsen with Roman Catholic chaplain colleagues. Welchman is on the middle row, third from the right, and Michael Morrison, his colleague that I mentioned, is right in the middle of the back row, fifth from the right or left. Finally, David Stewart was born in Ceredigion in West Wales in 1890, the youngest son of the village schoolmaster. Ordained a priest at the age of 24, he became an army chaplain at 50. And embarking for Europe only 3 days after D-Day, he entered Belsen in mid-May 1945, a month after liberation. So this evening I would like to explore the context that inspired Colonel Campbell's commendation of David Stewart's published account. Who were the padres of liberated Belsen? What did they do there, and how did they respond to what they witnessed? Why did Campbell, a medical officer, feel compelled to call his chaplains the true physicians? In asking these questions, I think we shall see that it was in the otherwise ordinary work of chaplaincy, but recalibrated for the unique circumstances presented by the aftermath of modern warfare and genocide, and especially in their interactions with Belsen's survivors, that the chaplains earned the recognition of Colonel Campbell in doing as much good as they could. As ordinary men themselves, reflecting a cross-section of the islands of Britain and Ireland, as well as the diversity of the church and British jury, they were amongst the very first to confront the profound challenge of how to live a life of faith in a world forever changed by an encounter with the Holocaust and with the people who survived it. For me, my own encounter with these chaplains and their stories began several years ago. I was working at the Council of Christians and Jews, CCJ. Founded at the height of the Second World War, CCJ became the first national organisation in the UK dedicated to interfaith relations. And one of my responsibilities at CCJ was to lead Christian clergy on an annual 10-day seminar at the International School of Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And the question that summed up the justification for taking a group of church ministers and lay leaders to Israel to hear lectures, engage in workshops, and to meet a survivor was this: how should Christians respond to knowledge of the Holocaust? The Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the pre-war European population, including 9 out of 10 European Jewish children. It's important that any history of the Holocaust is rooted in the experiences and narratives of Jews themselves. Yes, as a human story that involved bystanders, as well as perpetrators and victims. The Holocaust also raises acute questions of non-Jewish witnesses and of all who are confronted with its after effects. So to help answer that first question I had at Yad Vashem, I began to realise that we should ask another question. As someone from the United Kingdom, raised as a Christian, son of a Methodist minister, I was brought up on stories of the war, meeting veterans in our congregations, listening to survivors of the Holocaust deliver their testimonies. And I began to become curious to know how had Christians responded at the time to their knowledge of the Holocaust. With a greater awareness of how Jews and non-Jews encountered one another in the aftermath of the destruction of the Holocaust, I felt we might be better equipped to meet the challenges we face today, of improving understanding, trust, and equal dignity between neighbours who remain estranged. Asking these questions eventually led me to discover the stories of David Stewart and his colleagues at Belsen. Belsen, I knew, was the major site liberated by the British in the Nazi concentration camp system. It has always occupied a particular space within British and Irish memory of the Holocaust. I also knew that a friend's father was Isaac Levy, one of the Jewish chaplains working at Belsen after its liberation, and I began to wonder how many other army chaplains had worked there with him. I studied some of their writings, preserved in archives like the Royal Army Chaplains Museum. I eventually met the daughters of John Ross and T.J. Stretch, the next generation who had lived with the knowledge of their father's experiences. I also spoke to former parishioners of David Stewart, whom we began with, who's pictured here, and who remembered him from the time of his return to England after the war. And eventually a picture began to emerge of the chaplaincy experience at Belsen. From the 15th of April 1945, the Royal Army Chaplains Department faced an entirely new situation in their own history, a unique challenge to faith and to chaplaincy, and a profound confrontation with the aftermath of the Holocaust. What's Belsen? Asked British Army officer Derek Sington when he first heard its name in April 1945. The Soviet Army had come upon the Nazis' easternmost killing centres over the previous 9 months, including Majdanek and Treblinka in July 1944 and Auschwitz in January 1945. Though the Western governments had known of Nazi mass killings of Jews since at least 1942, it was not until they themselves entered former camps that British servicemen could begin to grapple with what these camps looked like, how they operated, and who were their intended victims. Derek Sington would soon begin to answer his own question. Control of Bergen-Belsen was handed over to the British in a ceasefire, ostensibly because the Germans had lost control of a rapidly spreading typhus epidemic. On the 15th of April, Sington drove into the camp with a loudspeaker to announce to the former inmates that they were free. Belsen was not intended to operate as a so-called death camp. It had originally been a German army barracks and training ground. It evolved from a prisoner of war camp for Russians captured on the Eastern Front into a so-called exchange camp for Jews whom the Nazis intended to use for diplomatic barter. As the mass murder of Jews intensified in the summer of 1944, prisoners from elsewhere in the concentration camp system were increasingly transported to Belsen. And over the winter of 1944 to 45, as the eastern camps were evacuated in the face of the advancing Soviet army and surviving inmates force-marched west, Belsen became seriously overcrowded. The camp infrastructure could not cope with the numbers, which reached a peak of over 60,000 in April 1945. So in reality, it had become a death camp. Typhus and other diseases were rife, the dead lay unburied in their thousands. Of those surviving, some 2/3 were Jewish. At Liberation, medics hurried to stop the spread of disease and to nurse the sick. War artists and photographers, journalists and film crews began to record the sights. And amongst the very first personnel to arrive at liberated Belsen, some days before the arrival of the Red Cross and other relief teams, were army chaplains. Around 3,600 chaplains served the British Army during the Second World War. Their roles were numerous: on the home front, in training camps and military bases, on convoys and on the front line, chaplains conducted regular services. They buried the dead, and they comforted the wounded, and they acted as a pastoral support to men and women in the extreme circumstances of war. All of these responsibilities were crucial in maintaining what historian Michael Snape calls a culture of personal religiosity in the military. The resources of religion could serve what military authorities perceived as chaplains' most important task to help to maintain the morale of the fighting forces. The changing realities of the war, however, meant that these responsibilities had to be adapted to extreme lengths. And chaplains confronted a profound test when they found themselves face to face with liberated Belsen. This was not the same challenge for Christian chaplains as it was for their Jewish colleagues. And I should say I'm indebted to the scholarship of Dr. Jonathan Lewis, who's here this evening. I can't quite see him, but thanks, Jonathan, for your book and your articles that have explored the experience of Jewish chaplains at Belsen. Leslie Hardman and Isaac Levy were the first Jews from the Free Nations whom survivors of Belsen encountered after years of persecution and incarceration, after the destruction of their communities and the murders of their families. There was a deep emotional significance to their meetings. Hardman arrived at Belsen's Camp 1, the part of the camp in the worst condition, soon to be named the Horror Camp. And the first person he met was a girl who introduced him to her friends in the camp. They began to speak in Yiddish, the common language of much of Eastern European Jewry. And then they noticed the Star of David, the Magen David, in Hardman's chaplain's insignia. Hardman recalled in his memoir, "One poor creature touched and then stroked the badge of my faith, and finding that it was real, murmured, 'Rabbina, Rabbina.' Now the others crowded around me, touching and stroking my tunic. They had someone of their own, a Jew like themselves, but free, and in a British uniform, come to take them by the hand and lead them out of this inferno." His senior colleague, Isaac Levy, arrived at Belsen a week later and first saw the relatively more stable conditions in the part of the camp which was a few miles down the road from the horror camp. On seeing the Magen David on his uniform, survivors insisted he address them in Yiddish. But Levy found that he could not, for, as he put it in a letter to his family, he was overcome with emotion, especially when I saw that so many of them wore a cardboard homemade badge on which was drawn a blue and white Magen David. This was their assertion that the Jewish people lived. Jewish chaplains were able to offer, from the very moment of their arrival at Belsen, a form of spiritual relief and a sense of solidarity to their fellow Jews. Their Christian colleagues' resources for responding were, of course, different. Reading their first reactions, it's clear just how shocking were the sights of liberated Belsen. On the 17th of April, Michael Morrison wrote to his superior in the Jesuit order in Dublin. The sights, bluntly, were indescribable, he said. T.J. Stretch arrived the same day. He described the overcrowding of the camp huts, piles of dead bodies, and the impact of starvation and unsanitary conditions. Inspecting the camp with one of the senior medical officers, Stretch concluded that many of the people cannot be saved. They have been starved systematically. They are walking skeletons. Herbert Welchman, Morrison's senior Catholic chaplain, was even more blunt. He said in his report in the first few days that the survivors were a vast mass of pitiable humanity. In these scenes of horror, recounted through memories shaped by the sensory intensity of those first days, chaplains found the camps such an inhuman atrocity that the human cost, the personal stories, were often lost in their immediate retelling. The sheer numbers of dead at Belsen were huge. The necessity of quick mass burials to prevent further spread of disease meant that often in the first days after the liberation, less attention was given to understanding the identities of the camp's victims. Stretch was interviewed and filmed by Movietone News above one such mass grave, stating, "This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are." I think it's perhaps unsurprising that Christian chaplains were sometimes vague, at least in the initial days of liberation, regarding the identities of the victims of the camp. They arrived often without prior awareness of the conditions which they would face. The Christian chaplains had little personal knowledge of the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies. Even when the war came to an end some 3 weeks after the transfer of Belsen to the British, David Stewart, yet to arrive at Belsen, was about 50 miles away. He wrote that it was blazing weather, and in our ample spare hours we lazed under the trees of the orchard where our sleeping tents were pitched. We were unutterably bored, he said. He and the men discussed the general election, their forthcoming release from active service, and occasionally a visiting officer, he said, would talk of Buchenwald and Belsen, but we listened a little sceptically. The ministry of the chaplain, however, would soon give them opportunity to learn more about the camp and to affirm the identities of Belsen's victims. And it began as they buried the dead. Conducting the funerals of men killed in action was one of the defining duties of an army chaplain. Regulations stipulated that as far as possible, the dead be buried with uniformity in individual plots, the location recorded, and that a funeral service should be conducted by a chaplain of the deceased's own denomination. The legacy of this meticulousness achieved a sense of democracy in the burial of the dead. Recording names preserved the deceased's individuality as far as was possible. And of course, many of us will have seen the evidence of this in the ranks of uniform headstones in Commonwealth cemeteries. When chaplains entered Belsen, burials for the victims was one of their primary concerns. But in scale, it was a completely different task to anything else that had faced them before, even amidst the horrors that they'd already observed in battle. And in letters to their family and colleagues, chaplains consistently drew attention to the sheer numbers of dead whom they were forced to bury. These burials were captured on film, and it's possible in watching some of this footage, which you can do online in digitised archives, and tracing its reception, to obtain a sense of the visceral impact of these scenes. One clip shows Leslie Hardman wiping away his tears. A photograph of Michael Morrison on the left here, praying over a mass grave, was published on the front page of the Catholic newspaper, The Universe. John Ross was filmed saying his own prayers over a mass grave. Family friend on active service in Mandate Palestine saw the newsreel footage in Jerusalem. Surrounded by a Jewish cinema audience, many of them seeing footage of the Holocaust aftermath for the very first time, Ross's friend jumped from his cinema seat, shouting, "There's Jack." The very nature of a mass grave of thousands of bodies meant that the names of the victims could not be identified. And liberators could not determine who was Jewish or not, where they had come from, or try and seek to understand for what reason the Nazis had imprisoned them. TJ Stretch's comment on camera that we don't know who they are is therefore perhaps understandable. But the resources available to chaplains ensured that the dead and the dying received some of the religious rituals which define such crucial aspects of their lived identities. Herbert Welchman described administering the last rites to Roman Catholics. He said that it was most touching to see the gratitude of these poor souls for the consolations of their religion, of which they had been deprived so long. And at each mass grave, prayers were said by a Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish chaplain. Though exact numbers of the dead of each faith could not be verified, there was at least some respect for distinctive religious traditions, as well as acknowledgement that the majority of the camp's victims, and indeed its survivors, were Jewish. Leslie Hardman later described the moving symbolism of such moments. He stood at one grave of over 5,000 dead with his Protestant and Roman Catholic colleagues. I asked my fellow padre if he would like to say the first prayers, but he said it would be more fitting if I did so, as most of the dead were Jewish. And so, with bursting heart, the salt tears coursing down my cheeks, I said the prayers for the dead. It is the custom of the Jews to keep their heads covered when in prayer, and by keeping their heads covered also, my two companions showed their respect for my people and for me. Then the Protestant padre said his prayers, and the three of us stood with bowed, uncovered heads. As we left the grave, I was still crying, and my companions too were deeply moved. Some of the most lasting images of Belsen's liberation are those of chaplains standing together over the gravesides. Though the dead were anonymous, chaplain survivors helped to reaffirm identities of those who had been murdered, granting the resources of religion to which they had long been denied, and demonstrating some form of Christian Jewish solidarity in grief, a solidarity that defied the victims' murderers. Once the prayers had been said and the survivors had been evacuated from the horrors of Belsen's Camp 1 to the hospitals that were established in the former Wehrmacht barracks a few miles away, chaplains' distinctive responsibilities continued to be realised in the work of pastoral care that followed. David Stewart's 35th Casualty Clearing Station arrived at Belsen on the 15th of May. With his colleague TJ Davies, Stewart established a chaplain's office in the hospital. From there, they toured the wards and distributed materials which they felt would help the patients in their recovery. Stewart went from patient to patient, distributing sweets and cigarettes, needles and thread. Roman Catholic chaplains said Mass, and by the time Michael Morrison left Belsen at the end of May, he was able to report to the Jesuit authorities that all Catholics had received Holy Communion at least once. And as well as distributing welfare packages, chaplains also help patients to trace which, if any, of their families and communities had likewise survived. Padre Stewart distributed writing materials among the wards. It gave him an insight into the geographical reach of Nazi persecution and the extent of the destruction in people's families. He said that multitudes of letters were written to people in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, France, Belgium, Holland, Greece, Yugoslavia, America, England, and Palestine. Many of our people had no relatives left. They had died in the crematoria at Auschwitz. They had no one to send a letter to. John Ross did similar work, writing to his sister in Scotland at the same time Stuart was setting up his office. I did most of my work running what we called an interview room, answering questions, dealing with requests and complaints, and running a kind of post office for those who wanted to write letters. Most of them only knew a name and a town, or some a country only, but some few had good addresses in England. I eventually sent most of the letters to a society in London which tries to trace missing relations. But I wrote direct myself in a small number of cases when the address was complete, and have had half a dozen answers. A very small number, but at least some result. One woman had 2 sons in Loughborough College, and another boy and girl in a Moravian school near Leeds. In each case, I wrote to the principal, and have since had several letters from the families, and sent several back. Ross shared this office with one of the Jewish chaplains, probably Leslie Hardman. Hardman wrote in his own memoir that in a small room, hundreds of people came to seek my help, seeking to answer the questions of survivors, such as 2 sisters who asked for help in tracing their brother. Rabbi, they said, will you find him for us? Helping to facilitate this initial work of tracing, chaplains began to learn how Jews had been specifically targeted by the Nazi regime, and as the survivors recuperated, they began to share their stories. Contrary to the persistent myth, in this period, immediately after the war, survivors were not silent about their experiences. Those surviving tellers of tales, as Elie Wiesel called them, demonstrated an urgency to tell the truth of their experiences. And as survivors told their stories, chaplains listened. When Leslie Hardman arrived at Belsen, he said that he expected the survivors to cry, but instead they began to talk. As Hardman found, Jewish chaplains often experienced this urgency to talk. Isaac Levy described how in speaking to some survivors in Yiddish, immediately I was overwhelmed with their story. Non-Jewish chaplains were similarly confronted with stories from early on. Survivors clearly felt an urgent need to testify to the truth, but I also think that there was something about chaplains that made them more approachable than other liberators. Whilst they could not have been prepared for the conditions into which they entered on liberation, chaplains were trained to support and experienced in supporting people in extreme emotional circumstances. And in the absence of formal medical duties, engaging in conversation, listening, became an everyday aspect of pastoral ministry. Not every chaplain left evidence that they spent their time listening with sympathy and sensitivity. Some only spent hours or a few days at the camp. Others, however, particularly those who spent more prolonged periods of time with the survivors, found listening to their stories to be at the heart of the chaplain's welfare responsibilities. In his daily hospital rounds, David Stewart began conversations by asking the survivors about their experiences. Who are you? He would ask. What is your name? And why were you in the cages? A term used by survivors for the camps. The survivor's response, he recalled, was invariably to respond with a question for him. Would you care to listen? And listen, Stewart did. Though he acknowledged the language barrier, he also found that needs must in extreme circumstances. And with a dictionary, with survivors acting as interpreters, and what he called the determination to understand the needs of the patients, communication was possible. 23-year-old Hungarian Jewish survivor Clara would meet Stewart every evening with the words, "Sit down, please, and talk to me. I'm so happy you have come." So every night while we smoked a cigarette together, I would talk with her and she unfolded her story to me. Clara's marriage took place in November 1942, this is what Stewart wrote, and her husband, who held a commission in the Hungarian army, was taken prisoner by the Russians in May 1943. Clara left her flat in Budapest and went to live with her father. Late in 1943, they were forced to leave their house and lived in a crowded house in the ghetto. All her father's wealth and property were confiscated. Early in 1944, both were rushed to Auschwitz. Here, her father was separated from her and was sent to the gas chambers, and Clara to the Bremen slave camp. All the slave workers were marched to Belsen. Clara was among them. Typhus was raging in the camp. Survivors shared their experiences of life before Nazi occupation, recording the escalation, as we've heard, of Nazi persecution through the identification of Jewish populations, the theft of property, ghettoization, transportation, gas chambers, forced labour, death marches, and then liberation. So in listening, chaplains gained insights into a wider picture of Nazi policy that extended to other places in the camp system, and in Belsen many survivors referenced Auschwitz. Padre Stewart recorded survivors' names, their identities, their Jewish identities, and their nationalities, and he even included some of their photographs. These are totally distinct from the usual horror images and newsreel footage that we associate with liberated Belsen, photographs which could inform very little about the lived experiences of victims of Nazi persecution. So by including these kinds of photographs in his pamphlet, Stewart used a combination of words and images to fill those gaps in his readers' understanding. And this photograph here depicts 4 young women, their arms around one another, and alongside their photographs, Stewart shared their story. Sisters, Blanca, Irena, Magda, and Anna, all Hungarian Jews. Stewart noted down what they recorded to him of the deportation to Auschwitz, the selections, the murders by gas, but he also included small facts about their lives before the war, such as their father's drapery business, which could only have been revealed from personal attention to the details of what they were sharing to him. Stewart's photograph of the 4 sisters could portray something intensely personal, the meaning which survivors found in rebuilding family in defiance of the horrific loss of relatives which they had described to him. So once the dead had been buried, after religious dividing lines had been crossed through moments of prayer, as the process of liberation went on, the distinctiveness of the chaplain's responsibilities was especially realised in this work of pastoral care. Through prolonged opportunities for encounters, chaplains were brought face to face with survivors' urgent need to testify to where they had come from and to what had happened to them. Even if the stories David Stewart and others recorded were only snapshots of testimony, in recognising their importance, he published what are, I believe, the very earliest post-liberation accounts of Jewish experiences of the Holocaust published in English. In response to one testimony, he concluded, "What could one say in the face of such grief as that? Here was sacred ground." Appropriately, for one who recognised so clearly the importance of making space for survivors' experiences, it was in this act of recounting and listening that Stewart, as a Christian minister, would come to most obviously feel the presence of God. If survivors expressed an urgency to testify to their experiences, for chaplains the liberation inspired responses of varied forms. They hurried to tell others. Some wrote letters to their families to whom they could pass on often and express their deep emotions. Formal written reports and letters to the press expressed chaplains' intention to tell the truth about their experiences. 5 days after his arrival, T.J. Stretch chose to record what he had seen in a 3-page report. He began by saying, "I don't know whether I ought to write this." He feared that he would not be believed, or that his readers would assume he exaggerated his report, that it would be dismissed as just another atrocity story. Nevertheless, he felt he had to write. "This is so ghastly a story that the whole world should know about it," he said, and concluded, "All I have written about I have seen, and what I have seen I shall never forget, never." The copy of Stretch's report that is held in the Royal Army Chaplains Museum shows that he authenticated the final page with his name and the words Belsen Camp, April the 22nd, 1945, in a final act testifying to the truth of what he had written. Chaplains left liberated camps once the dead had been buried or their units were moved on by the demands of the war, or when their hospitals were replaced by incoming relief organisations. After the war in Europe ended at the beginning of May, some soon returned home. And in the years after the war, chaplains talked to others and in public about their experiences at the camps. Stretch finally left the chaplaincy in January 1947, and he found a new parish in Chaplain, Lancashire. He would serve churches in the northwest of England for the rest of his priesthood until his death in 1973. The Chaplain branch of the United Nations Association hosted Stretch as a speaker in the spring of 1947, where a local newspaper reported about the details that he gave of his experience at Belsen. John Ross noted in his diary his departure from Europe on the 1st of October 1945. 2 days later, a train from Aberdeen pulled into the small station in the village of Torfins just down the road from his home in Kincardine O'Neill. His daughter recalls that Ross ran to his family down the platform, and a photograph taken soon after his return shows his two girls taller than they were when he first left for war, and Ross having replaced his uniform with a clerical suit, visibly wearing the strain of 6 years of chaplaincy. But he was soon sharing his experiences with his local community. On the 19th of November, his diary records that he gave an evening talk about Belsen. What might Ross have said just 7 months after he first reached the camp? The scale and horror of the crimes that were revealed at Liberation have, in the generations since, posed profound questions for religion. At the heart of such a confrontation has been, as Elie Wiesel put it, the enigma of God's action in history. Where was God when the Holocaust took place? Was God absent or present? Who bears responsibility, God or humankind? And such questions have challenged both Jews and Christians. On the day that he arrived at Belsen, Padre Ross wrote in his diary, Proverbs 12:2. He referred to the following Bible verse: "A good man obtains favour of the Lord, but a man of wicked devices he condemns." That Ross should think of this particular verse on the 18th of April 1945 suggests that even at this point, in his first engagement with the camp, he was already contemplating that question of divine or individual responsibility for such atrocities. In that initial confrontation with the horrors of liberated Belsen, Ross did not appear to claim that God was ultimately responsible, but that God would condemn the man of wicked devices, the man-made evil which caused it. David Stewart also reflected as a Christian on the things to which he had listened at the foot of survivors' beds in Belsen. His faith certainly influenced his decision to publish his pamphlet, The Crime of Belsen. In his conclusion, he said, "That was Belsen as I knew it. I have exaggerated nothing. If anything, I have refrained from telling the whole truth. But what I have written is true, so witness me, God." The Crime of Belsen is largely a factual account. It's not a work of theology. Though Stewart did not reflect at length about the nature of evil, the relationship between Christians and Jews, or the responsibility of the church in the long history of anti-Semitism, references in the pamphlet to God are commonplace, occurring in the midst of his descriptions of his everyday, day-to-day interactions with survivors. When Magda told him that she thought that God himself has surely forgotten me, Stewart responded, "No, Magda, God has not forgotten you, and there are many who will be glad you lived." Stewart took up a biblically inspired obligation to witness, not only by recording the stories to which he listened or publishing his pamphlet, but also in sharing his experiences with other Christians. 2 of the only 6 known surviving copies of The Crime of Belsen remain in the possession of his former parishioners. At the end of the war, Stuart had returned to his parish in Suffolk that he had left when he volunteered as a chaplain, and his final parish was in Herefordshire, and one of those churches is pictured here. In these two rural communities, Stuart passed on his pamphlet as a record of his experiences. Belsen is not finished with, Stuart wrote in his epilogue. At the end of many of the cameos he published, he pondered the survivors' future. As chaplains left Belsen, the survivors were faced with the prospect of rebuilding their lives in displaced persons camps, contending with continuing anti-Semitism, whilst they traced their surviving relatives and sought a safe and lasting home. The repercussions of the Holocaust were far from over. Chaplains entered Belsen amongst a multitude of military personnel. At first, like other liberators, chaplains were shocked and unprepared for what they were confronted with. In the immediate crisis of burying the dead and rescuing those who could be saved, the identities of the murdered and the survivors were often out of reach. But for the chaplains, responsibilities developed that were distinct from their fellow liberators. At mass grave sites, through prayer, they challenged the anonymity of the dead. Through their welfare work, they listened to the survivors as they recounted what they had endured. In witnessing to Belsen, through writing and public speaking, most chaplains did not articulate a radical change in their faith, but their faith was not unchanged either. Padre Ross's scribbled Bible verse in his diary, written in sight of the mass graves over which he had prayed, spoke of a deeply personal attempt to make sense of the burials of thousands of people at a time, ascribing to the individual the responsibilities for such atrocities, also suggested an increased advocacy for human responsibility in the post-war world. In 6 months' time, we will mark the 80th anniversary of the Liberation of Belsen. At the forefront of that commemoration should rightly be the remembrance of over 50,000 Jews and other victims murdered at Belsen by the Nazis and their collaborators. But amidst our remembering this evening, I would like to suggest should also be the names of David Stewart, John Ross, T.J. Stretch, Michael Morrison, Herbert Welchman, Leslie Hardman, Isaac Levy and their colleagues, known and unknown. The true physicians, they were called. Army chaplains could not have been prepared for what they saw at Belsen. They did not know always how best to proceed. But guided by faith and equipped by the resources of chaplaincy, they did what they could to affirm the sanctity of the individual through religious ritual, to aid the survivor's rehabilitation through pastoral care, and in response to the denial or disinterest of others, to witness to the truth. And in remembering their stories, we ourselves can take on the responsibility to witness. Part of that continuing witness, I'd like to conclude, is to advocate for the values of chaplaincy. In other words, to practice in everyday life the principle of helping the person whom we encounter, any person, to uphold their individuality, to listen to their stories, and to do what good we can. Leslie Hardman ended his memoir with a reflection as he left Belsen for the last time, writing this: "No man can do more than his measure, but my measure had been so small. Someone at the gate gave a final wave. I released the brake and drove forward. There was still something I could do. I could tell the world." Thank you very much. Yeah, I will. Yeah, thank you.
I'm very grateful to Rob for such a stimulating and informative lecture this evening. In speaking with Rob before this evening began, I was exploring with him how much of the DNA of contemporary chaplaincy is rooted in First World War experiences of our great heroic chaplains, to the extent that sometimes we are a little guilty of ignoring all of those who have built upon that legacy since. Rob, thank you, because you have helped us to remember some of that legacy this evening. You have stirred in us again some of that critical DNA that comes about through chaplaincy presence, often in the most horrific of circumstances. And we rise to the challenge that you present to us, I think, in wanting to share that story with others. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm now going to hand you over to all of them so they can interrogate at some greater length. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no questions.
Peter House and Rob, thank you for that tour de force, really, which we almost need a period of silence to reflect on. And it's been a privilege of mine to walk alongside you, or a long way behind you, during at least part of your PhD research. It was also my privilege to serve in Hona, which was the name of the camp where the hospitals were. And to minister as the Methodist chaplain there in a building which had been part of the recovery process. My involvement in the 80s was also with the local German church and some organisation called the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Bergen-Belsen, which was concerned about telling the story, because at that time there was a simple hut largely full of British Army photographs of what had taken place there. I'm interested, through some of the work I've done on the German churches in the immediate post-war period, as to what the chaplains, when they moved on from Belsen, particularly those who stayed in Germany rather than those who went home, said and thought about the German population and what contact they may have had with the local German population around the camp. And whether they reflected on, as it were, war guilt and responsibility and where it lay.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you so much for all the insight I've gained from walking with you over the years. It's a really important question about the next stage of this story. There's the initial confrontation with the horrors and with the stories, and then there's 80 years since of steps forward, steps back, standing still in terms of the Christian-Jewish relationship, and especially what you say about the question of guilt and the question of how far the church was capable or willing to honestly face up to the history of anti-Semitism and the role of the churches or people of Christian faith in the Holocaust and in the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Most of the chaplains who were at Belsen soon left and soon returned home to the UK. David Stewart actually returned to Germany later, after a couple of years back in the UK. He returned to Germany. It's not a period of his life that he left any record of, so we can only guess at how he took the experience of Belsen into his encounters with ordinary Germans in the years afterwards. But perhaps I'll just share a story from my wider research. I've been interested to compare the experiences of British Army chaplains at Belsen with the chaplains of other nations, particularly United States Army chaplains at camps liberated by American troops. And one of those was a Methodist chaplain by the name of Wilson Canifax, who was only in his late 20s when he went to Germany in the spring of 1945. And he happened to visit Buchenwald, which was liberated at a very similar point to Belsen. mid-April. And later in the summer, as he was serving in, I can't remember exactly where, I think it was Frankfurt, serving in Germany in that summer of 45, he discovered that there was a local Methodist seminary in that town, and the principal of that seminary, who later became a bishop in the Methodist Church of Germany after the war, was in hospital. And so, being a young Methodist pastor, he went to go and see his superior or his more experienced colleague, and he told the bishop, the soon-to-become bishop, about what he had seen at Buchenwald. And you can only imagine that this young man, desperate to kind of share the experience of this with someone of more experience than him. But in his later retelling, Wilson Canifax said that the bishop said that these were propaganda stories of the Americans and that they weren't to be believed. So it gives an insight into some of the attitudes that were prevalent even after the war and even after the revelations of Belsen and Buchenwald and other camps. It took many years for the church officially to recognise the long history of Christian culpability and anti-Semitism. But I think that those chaplains who had opportunity to engage in personal relationships and encounter people face to face who had experienced some of those horrors, that their approach was slightly different. Even if it wasn't the kind of sophisticated response to the Holocaust and Christian-Jewish relations that we have today, nonetheless it was something very personal and coming out of their lived experiences. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question?
Robert, Jonathan Lewis, thank you for what you said. As there are not other questions, I wonder if you'd perhaps like me to share with people my experience when I was privileged to meet somebody who had served as a Jewish chaplain in Belsen. Shall I perhaps do that?
Please do, Jonathan, yeah.
Just before I do, to add to what you were saying, as everybody knows, liberation didn't just happen. It was the beginning of a transformative process. So many people were so desperately sick that people continued to die for weeks and months after the British Army came in on the 15th of April. One of the most moving documents that I've read is a record in the archives of the National Army Museum, kept by the British Army, of the number of deaths each day. And they gradually fall until you get to a date in June where somebody wrote, "Nobody died today." And I almost cried when I read that. There were, as you said, Robert, quite a number of other Christian chaplains of different denominations who served for varying periods of time in Belsen. There were also quite a number of other Jewish chaplains who likewise served for varying periods. Isaac Levy, almost immediately after he first went into Belsen, realised the need for chaplaincy support, and he sent a request, virtually a demand, to London for more people to be sent out. And several civilian ministers were dispatched, and they served for varying periods of time under the aegis of military control. One of them was a minister still in training. He became Reverend Avraham Greenbaum. He served in Belsen for some 15 months with some home leaves, and he married a survivor. As an aside, there were quite a number of marriages between Jewish British soldiers and people who had survived in the camp. And I actually came upon in an archive a record of his service and the periods that he'd been there. The woman whom he married was from Czechoslovakia. Some of her family had somehow made it to Mexico, because as life became more and more desperate in the 1930s for Jews, people got to any place they possibly could. How on earth they got to Mexico, who could say, but they did. So Avraham Greenbaum and his wife went to join her family in Mexico. Later, they went to Israel. They settled down in Israel. Avraham Greenbaum took up an academic position, and they had children and grandchildren. In the course of my research, which, as Robert kindly said, is into Jewish chaplaincy in the British Armed Forces, from, in fact, when it begins in 1892, through both wars until today, I was introduced by somebody to the family of Avraham Greenbaum. And it was arranged that I could visit him in his home in Jerusalem, which I took the opportunity to do something like 10 years ago when my wife and I were in Israel. At that stage he was 92, and he was in very poor health. He lived in a flat in Jerusalem, his daughter lived in another flat in the same block. The arrangement was that I had to call the daughter first thing in the morning to ask whether her father was well enough to see me. And I did, and she said yes. So I presented myself there at 9 o'clock. Avraham Greenbaum, wheelchair, oxygen, very, very quietly spoken, really a twinkle in his eye, and he engaged with me. And I said to him, please tell me whatever you want to tell me, but don't tell me anything that you don't. And he talked wholly, coherently, cogently for 2 hours. I brought it to a close because I could see that it was enough for him. And he told me a great deal, I wrote it all down, but yet I knew he was really actually telling me very little. There was so much more to know. So as I brought our talk to a close, he looked at me. I was sitting opposite him about as far away as we are now. And he said to me words that I'll never forget. He said, promise me, as an officer and a gentleman, that when you have written up your notes, you'll send them to me so that I can read them and assure you that they are correct. And I looked at him and I said, sir, I promise. People can probably guess the outcome of this story. We were back at home 10 days later, email from the doctor. He's passed away. Have I prepared my notes? Because they'd like to read them at what we call the shiva. That's the prayers that are held in a prayer house after somebody has passed away. They were half done. I sat up half the night and finished them and sent them off. One does wonder sometimes about the working of providence. But it was such a privilege for me to have met him, somebody who'd actually been there and was able to tell me what he did about what he'd experienced. So I thought that, Robert, with your permission, I would just share that with people.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Who found it interesting. Thank you.
Traditional, I think, to show our full appreciation for Rob. In certain subjects, one can't help but feel somewhat hopeless in response to the power of the narratives that we hear. And a simple round of applause feels utterly inadequate in such circumstances. But we do want you to know how very grateful we are for the power of those stories that you have shared with us this evening. And I hope the conversation will continue in a few moments as we retire for some light refreshments. But friends, Dr. Rob Thompson.
Thank you.